It was toward May when Dr. Willett, at the request of the senior ward, and fortified with all the Kerwin data which the family had gleaned from Charles in his non-secretive days, talked with the young man. The interview was of little value or conclusiveness, for Willett felt at every moment that Charles was thoroughly master of himself and in touch with matters of real importance, but it at least forced the secretive youth to offer some rational explanation of his recent demeanor. Of a pallid, impassive type, not easily showing embarrassment, Ward seemed quite ready to discuss his pursuits, though not to reveal their object. He stated that the papers of his ancestor had contained some remarkable secrets of early scientific knowledge, for the most part in cipher, of an apparent scope comparable only to the discoveries of Friar Bacon, and perhaps surpassing even those. They were, however, meaningless except when correlated with a body of learning now wholly obsolete, so that their immediate presentation to a world equipped only with modern science would rob them of all impressiveness and dramatic significance. To take their vivid place in the history of human thought, they must first be correlated by one familiar with the background out of which they evolved, and to this task of correlation, Ward was now devoting himself. He was seeking to acquire, as fast as possible, those neglected arts of old, which a true interpreter of the Kerwin data must possess, and hoped in time to make a full announcement and presentation of the utmost interest to mankind and to the world of thought. Not even Einstein, he declared, could more profoundly revolutionize the current conception of things. As to his graveyard search, whose object he freely admitted, but the details of whose progress he did not relate, he said he had reason to think that Joseph Kerwin's mutilated headstone bore certain mystic symbols, carved from directions in his will, and ignorantly spared by those who had effaced the name, which were absolutely essential to the final solution of his cryptic system. Kerwin, he believed, had wished to guard his secret with care, and had consequently distributed the data in an exceedingly curious fashion. When Dr. Willett asked to see the mystic documents, Ward displayed much reluctance and tried to put him off with such things as photostatic copies of the Hutchinson cipher and Orne formulae and diagrams, but finally showed him the exteriors of some of the real Kerwin finds. The journal and notes, the cipher, title in cipher also, and the formula-filled message, "To him who shall come after," and let him glance inside, such as were in obscure characters. He also opened the diary at a page carefully selected for its innocuousness, and gave Willett a glimpse of Kerwin's connected handwriting in English. The doctor noted very closely the crabbed and complicated letters and the general aura of the 17th century which clung round both penmanship and style, despite the writer's survival into the 18th century, and became quickly certain that the document was genuine. The text itself was relatively trivial, and Willett recalled only a fragment. Wednesday, 16th of October, 1754. My sloop the Wakeful this day, put in from London with 20th new men, picked up in ye Indies, Spaniards from Martinitho, and 2 Dutch men from Suriname. Ye Dutch men are like to desert from having heard somewhat ill of these ventures, but I will see to ye inducing of them to stay. For Mr. Knight Dexter of ye Bay and Book, 120 pieces camplets, 100 pieces assorted Campbellteens, 20 pieces blue duffels, 100 pieces shalloons, 50 pieces calamancos, 300 pieces each, shensoy and humbums. For Mr. Green at ye Elephant, 50-gallon kittles, 20 warming pans, 15 bake kittles, 10 per smokin' tongues. For Mr. Porrix, for Mr. Perigo, 1 set of awls. For Mr. Nightingale, 50 reams prime foolscap. Sage ye Sabbath, thrice last night, but none appeared. I must hear more from Mr. H. in Transylvania, though it is hard reaching him, and exceeding strange he cannot give me the use of what he hath so well used these 100 years. Simon hath not writ these 5 weeks, but I expect soon hearing from him. When, upon reaching this point, Dr. Willett turned the leaf, he was quickly checked by Ward, who almost snatched the book from his grasp. All that the doctor had a chance to see on the newly opened page was a brief pair of sentences, but these, strangely enough, lingered tenaciously in his memory. They ran, "Ye verse from Liber Damnatus, being spoke 5 rude masses, and 4 Hallows Eves, I am hopeful ye thing is breeding outside ye spheres. It will draw one who is to come, if I can make sure he shall be, and he shall think on past things, and look back through all ye years, against ye which I must have ready, ye salts or that to make 'em with." Willett saw no more, but somehow this small glimpse gave a new and vague terror to the painted features of Joseph Curwen, which stared blandly down from the overmantel. Ever after that he entertained the odd fancy, which his medical skill of course assured him was only a fancy, that the eyes of the portrait had a sort of wish, if not an actual tendency, to follow young Charles Ward as he moved about the room. He stopped before leaving to study the picture closely, marveling at its resemblance to Charles, and memorizing every minute detail of the cryptical, colorless face, even down to a slight scar or pit in the smooth brow above the right eye. Cosmo Alexander, he decided, was a painter worthy of the Scotland that produced Raeburn, and a teacher worthy of his illustrious pupil, Gilbert Stuart. Assured by the doctor that Charles's mental health was in no danger, but that, on the other hand, he was engaged in researches which might prove of real importance, the Wards were more lenient than they might otherwise have been, when during the following June, the youth made positive his refusal to attend college. He had, he declared, studies of much more vital importance to pursue, and intimated a wish to go abroad the following year in order to avail himself of certain sources of data not existing in America. The senior ward, while denying this latter wish as absurd for a boy of only 18, acquiesced regarding the university, so that after a none too brilliant graduation from the Moses Brown School, there ensued for Charles a 3-year period of intensive occult study and graveyard searching. He became recognized as an eccentric, and dropped even more completely from the sight of his family's friends than he had been before, keeping close to his works and only occasionally making trips to other cities to consult obscure records. Once he went south to talk with a strange old mulatto who dwelt in a swamp and about whom a newspaper had printed a curious article. Again he sought a small village in the Adirondacks whence reports of certain odd ceremonial practices had come, but still his parents forbade him the trip to the old world which he desired. Coming of age in April 1923, and having previously inherited a small competence from his maternal grandfather, Ward determined at last to take the European trip hitherto denied him. Of his proposed itinerary he would say nothing, save that the needs of his studies would carry him to many places, but he promised to write his parents fully and faithfully. When they saw he could not be dissuaded, they ceased all opposition and helped as best they could, so that in June the young man sailed for Liverpool with the farewell blessings of his father and mother, who accompanied him to Boston and waved him out of sight from the White Star Pier in Charlestown. Letters soon told of his safe arrival and of his securing good quarters in Great Russell Street, London, where he proposed to stay, shunning all family friends till he had exhausted the resources of the British Museum in a certain direction. Of his daily life he wrote but little, for there was little to write. Study and experiment consumed all his time, and he mentioned a laboratory which he had established in one of his rooms. That he said nothing of antiquarian rambles in the glamorous old city with its alluring skyline of ancient domes and steeples, and its tangles of roads and alleys whose mystic convolutions and sudden vistas alternately beckon and surprise, was taken by his parents as a good index of the degree to which his new interests had engrossed his mind. In June 1924, a brief note told of his departure for Paris, to which he had before made 1 or 2 flying trips for material in the Bibliothèque Nationale. For 3 months thereafter, he sent only postal cards, giving an address in the Rue Saint-Jacques and referring to a special search among rare manuscripts in the library of an unnamed private collector. He avoided acquaintances, and no tourists brought back reports of having seen him. Then came a silence, and in October the wards received a picture card from Prague, Czechoslovakia, stating that Charles was in that ancient town for the purpose of conferring with a certain very aged man, supposed to be the last living possessor of some very curious medieval information. He gave an address in the Neustadt and announced no move till the following January, when he dropped several cards from Vienna telling of his passage through that city on the way toward a more easterly region, whither one of his correspondents and fellow delvers into the occult had invited him. The next card was from Klausenburg in Transylvania and told of Ward's progress toward his destination. He was going to visit a Baron Ferenci, whose estate lay in the mountains east of Racus, and was to be addressed at Racus in the care of that nobleman. Another card from Racus a week later, saying that his host's carriage had met him, and that he was leaving the village for the mountains, was his last message for a considerable time. Indeed, he did not reply to his parents' frequent letters until May, when he wrote to discourage the plan of his mother for a meeting in London, Paris, or Rome during the summer, when the elder Wards were planning to travel in Europe. His researches, he said, were such that he could not leave his present quarters, while the situation of Baron Ferenci's castle did not favor visits. It was on a crag in the dark wooded mountains, and the region was so shunned by the country folk that normal people could not help feeling ill at ease. Moreover, the Baron was not a person likely to appeal to correct and conservative New England gentlefolk. His aspect and manners had idiosyncrasies, and his age was so great as to be disquieting. It would be better, Charles said, if his parents would wait for his return to Providence, which could scarcely be far distant. That return did not, however, take place until May 1926, when after a few heralding cards the young wanderer quietly slipped into New York on the Homeric and traversed the long miles to Providence by motor coach, eagerly drinking in the green rolling hills, the fragrant blossoming orchards, and the white steepled towns of Vernal, Connecticut. His first taste of ancient New England in nearly 4 years. When the coach crossed the Pawcatuck and entered Rhode Island, amidst the fairy goldenness of a late spring afternoon, his heart beat with quickened force, and the entry to Providence, along Reservoir and Elmwood Avenues, was a breathless and wonderful thing, despite the depths of forbidden lore to which he had delved. At the High Square, where Broadway, Bosset, and Empire Streets join, he saw before and below him, in the fire of sunset, the pleasant, remembered houses and domes and steeples of the old town, and his head swam curiously as the vehicle rolled down to the terminal behind the Biltmore, bringing into view the great dome and soft roof-pierced greenery of the ancient hill across the river, and the tall colonial spire of the First Baptist Church, limned pink in the magic evening light against the fresh springtime verdure of its precipitous background. Old Providence. It was this place and the mysterious forces of its long, continuous history which had brought him into being, and which had drawn him back toward marvels and secrets whose boundaries no prophet might fix. Here lay the arcana, wondrous or dreadful as the case might be, for which all his years of travel and application had been preparing him. A taxicab whirled him through Post Office Square, with its glimpse of the river, the old market house, and the head of the bay, and up the steep, curved slope of Waterman Street to Prospect, where the vast gleaming dome and sunset-flushed Ionic columns of the Christian Science Church beckoned northward. Then, 8 squares past the fine old estates his childish eyes had known, and the quaint brick sidewalks so often trodden by his youthful feet, and at last the little white overtaken farmhouse on the right. On the left, the classic Adam porch and stately bayed facade of the great brick house where he was born. It was twilight, and Charles Dexter Ward had come home. A school of alienists, slightly less academic than Dr. Lyman's, assigned to Ward's European trip the beginning of his true madness. Admitting that he was sane when he started, they believe that his conduct upon returning implies a disastrous change. But even to this claim, Dr. Willett refuses to accede. There was, he insists, something later, and the queerness of the youth at this stage he attributes to the practice of rituals learned abroad. Odd enough things, to be sure, but by no means implying mental aberration on the part of their celebrant. Ward himself, though visibly aged and hardened, was still normal in his general reactions, and in several talks with Willett displayed a balance which no madman, even an incipient one, could feign continuously for long. What elicited the notion of insanity at this period were the sounds heard at all hours from Ward's attic laboratory, in which he kept himself most of the time. There were chantings and repetitions and thunderous declamations in uncanny rhythms, and although these sounds were always in Ward's own voice, there was something in the quality of that voice and in the accents of the formulae it pronounced, which could not but chill the blood of every hearer. It was noticed that Nig, the venerable and beloved black cat of the household, bristled and arched his back perceptibly when certain of the tones were heard. The odors, occasionally wafted from the laboratory, were likewise exceedingly strange. Sometimes they were very noxious, but more often they were aromatic, with a haunting, elusive quality which seemed to have the power of inducing fantastic images. People who smelled them had a tendency to glimpse momentary mirages of enormous vistas, with strange hills or endless avenues of sphinxes and hippogriffs stretching off into infinite distance. Ward did not resume his old-time rambles, but applied himself diligently to the strange books he had brought home, and to equally strange delvings within his quarters, explaining that European sources had greatly enlarged the possibilities of his work, and promising great revelations in the years to come. His older aspect increased, to a startling degree, his resemblance to the Curwen portrait in his library, and Dr. Willett would often pause by the latter after a call, marveling at the virtual identity, and reflecting that only the small pit above the picture's right eye now remained to differentiate the long-dead wizard from the living youth. These calls of Willet's, undertaken at the request of the senior wards, were curious affairs. Ward at no time repulsed the doctor, but the latter saw that he could never reach the young man's inner psychology. Frequently, he noted peculiar things about little wax images of grotesque design on the shelves or tables, and the half-erased remnants of circles, triangles, and pentagrams in chalk or charcoal on the cleared central space of the large room. And always in the night, those rhythms and incantations thundered, till it became very difficult to keep servants or suppress furtive talk of Charles's madness. In January 1927, a peculiar incident occurred. One night, about midnight, as Charles was chanting a ritual whose weird cadence echoed unpleasantly through the house below, there came a sudden gust of chill wind from the bay, and a faint, obscure trembling of the earth, which everyone in the neighborhood noted. At the same time, the cat exhibited phenomenal traces of fright, while dogs bayed for as much as a mile around. This was the prelude to a sharp thunderstorm, anomalous for the season, which brought with it such a crash that Mr. and Mrs. Ward believed the house had been struck. They rushed upstairs to see what damage had been done, but Charles met them at the door to the attic, pale, resolute, and portentous, with an almost fearsome combination of triumph and seriousness on his face. He assured them that the house had not really been struck, and that the storm would soon be over. They paused, and looking through a window, saw that he was indeed right, for the lightning flashed farther and farther off, whilst the trees ceased to bend in the strange, frigid gust from the water. The thunder sank to a sort of dull, mumbling chuckle, and finally died away. Stars came out, and the stamp of triumph on Charles Ward's face crystallized into a very singular expression. For 2 months or more after this incident, Ward was less confined than usual to his laboratory. He exhibited a curious interest in the weather, and made odd inquiries about the date of the spring thawing of the ground. One night, late in March, he left the house after midnight, and did not return till almost morning, when his mother, being wakeful, heard a rumbling motor draw up to the carriage entrance. Muffled oaths could be distinguished, and Mrs. Ward, rising and going to the window, saw 4 dark figures removing a long, heavy box from a truck at Charles's direction, and carrying it within by the side door. She heard labored breathing and ponderous footfalls on the stairs, and finally a dull thumping in the attic. After which the footfalls descended again, and the 4 men reappeared outside and drove off in their truck. The next day, Charles resumed his strict attic seclusion, drawing down the dark shades of his laboratory windows and appearing to be working on some metal substance. He would open the door to no one, and steadfastly refused all preferred food. About noon, a wrenching sound, followed by a terrible cry and a fall, were heard. But when Mrs. Ward rapped at the door, her son at length answered faintly, and told her that nothing had gone amiss. The hideous and indescribable stench, now welling out, was absolutely harmless, and unfortunately necessary. Solitude was the one prime essential, and he would appear later for dinner. That afternoon, after the conclusion of some odd hissing sounds which came from behind the locked portal, he did finally appear, wearing an extremely haggard aspect and forbidding anyone to enter the laboratory upon any pretext. This, indeed, proved the beginning of a new policy of secrecy, for never afterward was any other person permitted to visit either the mysterious garret workroom or the adjacent storeroom, which he cleaned out, furnished roughly, and added to his inviolably private domain as a sleeping apartment. Here he lived, with books brought up from his library beneath, till the time he purchased the Pawtuxet bungalow and moved to it all his scientific effects. In the evening, Charles secured the paper before the rest of the family and damaged part of it through an apparent accident. Later on, Dr. Willett, having fixed the date from statements by various members of the household, looked up an intact copy at the journal office and found that in the destroyed section the following small item had occurred. Nocturnal diggers surprised in North Burial Ground. Robert Hart, night watchman at the North Burial Ground, this morning discovered a party of several men with a motor truck in the oldest part of the cemetery, but apparently frightened them off before they had accomplished whatever their object may have been. The discovery took place at about 4 o'clock, when Hart's attention was attracted by the sound of a motor outside his shelter. Investigating, he saw a large truck on the main drive, several rods away, but could not reach it before the sound of his feet on the gravel had revealed his approach. The men hastily placed a large box in the truck and drove away toward the street before they could be overtaken. And since no known grave was disturbed, Hart believes that this box was an object which they wished to bury. The diggers must have been at work for a long while before detection, for Hart found an enormous hole dug at a considerable distance back from the roadway in the lot of Amasa Field, where most of the old stones of long ago disappeared. The hole, a place as large and deep as a grave, was empty, and did not coincide with any interment mentioned in the cemetery records. Sergeant Riley of the 2nd Station viewed the spot and gave the opinion that the hole was dug by bootleggers, rather gruesomely and ingeniously seeking a safe cache for liquor, in a place not likely to be disturbed. In reply to questions, Hart said he thought the escaping truck had headed up Rocambeau Avenue, though he could not be sure. During the next few days, Ward was seldom seen by his family, having added sleeping quarters to his attic realm. He kept closely to himself there, ordering food brought to the door and not taking it until after the servant had gone away. The droning of monotonous formulae and the chanting of bizarre rhythms recurred at intervals, while at other times occasional listeners could detect the sound of tinkling glass, hissing chemicals, running water, or roaring gas flames. Odors of the most unplaceable quality, wholly unlike any before noted, hung at times around the door, and the air of tension observable in the young recluse whenever he did venture briefly forth was such as to excite the keenest speculation. Once he made a hasty trip to the Athenaeum for a book he required, and again he hired a messenger to fetch him a highly obscure volume from Boston. Suspense was written portentously over the whole situation, and both the family and Dr. Willett confessed themselves wholly at a loss what to do or think about it. Then, on the 15th of April, a strange development occurred. While nothing appeared to grow different in kind, there was certainly a very terrible difference in degree, and Dr. Willett somehow attaches great significance to the change. The day was Good Friday, a circumstance of which the servants made much, but which others quite naturally dismiss as an irrelevant coincidence. Late in the afternoon, young Ward began repeating a certain formula in a singularly loud voice, at the same time burning some substance so pungent that its fumes escaped over the entire house. The formula was so plainly audible in the hall outside the locked door that Mrs. Ward could not help memorizing it as she waited and listened anxiously. And later on, she was able to write it down at Dr. Willett's request. It ran as follows, and experts have told Dr. Willett that its very close analogy can be found in the mystic writings of Eliphas Levi, that cryptic soul who crept through a crack in the forbidden door and glimpsed frightful vistas of the void beyond. Per Adonai Elohim, Adonai Jehovah, Adonai Sabaoth, Metraton on agla, Mathon, verbum pythonicum, mysterium salamandre, convectus servorem antra, nomorum demonia culi god, almonsim gibor, Jehusua, evam zariatnat mik, vani. This had been going on for 2 hours without change or intermission when over all the neighborhood a pandemic howling of dogs set in. The extent of this howling can be judged from the space it received in the papers the next day, but to those in the Ward household, it was overshadowed by the odor, which instantly followed it. A hideous, all-pervasive odor, which none of them had ever smelt before, or ever smelt since. In the midst of this mephitic flood, there came a very perceptible flash like that of lightning, which would have been blinding and impressive but for the daylight around. And then was heard the voice that no listener can ever forget because of its thunderous remoteness, its incredible depth, and its eldritch dissimilarity to Charles Ward's voice. It shook the house and was clearly heard by at least 2 neighbors above the howling of the dogs. Mrs. Ward, who had been listening in despair outside her son's locked laboratory, shivered as she recognized its hellish import. For Charles had told her of its evil fame in dark books, and of the manner in which it had thundered, according to the Fenner letters, above the doomed Pawtuxet farmhouse on the night of Joseph Curwen's annihilation. There was no mistaking that nightmare phrase, for Charles had described it too vividly in the old days when he had talked frankly of his Curwen investigations. And yet it was only this fragment of an archaic and forgotten language. Dies meas, yeshet buen duasef, dove minit maus. Close upon this thundering, there came a momentary darkening of the daylight, though sunset was still an hour distant, and then a puff of added odor different from the first, but equally unknown and intolerable. Charles was chanting again now, and his mother could hear syllables that sounded like Yinash Yog Satoth Helikbel Fithrodag, ending in a Ya, whose maniacal force mounted in an ear-splitting crescendo. A second later, all previous memories were effaced by the wailing scream, which burst out with frantic explosiveness and gradually changed form to a paroxysm of diabolic and hysterical laughter. Mrs. Ward, with the mingled fear and blind courage of maternity, advanced and knocked affrightedly at the concealing panels, but obtained no sign of recognition. She knocked again, but paused nervelessly as a second shriek arose, this one unmistakable in the familiar voice of her son, and sounding concurrently with the still bursting cachinations of that other voice. Presently she fainted, although she is still unable to recall the precise and immediate cause. Memory sometimes makes merciful deletions. Mr. Ward returned from the business section at about 6:15, and not finding his wife downstairs, was told by the frightened servants that she was probably watching at Charles's door, from which the sounds had been stranger than ever before. Mounting the stairs at once, he saw Mrs. Ward stretched at full length on the floor of the corridor outside the laboratory, and realizing that she had fainted, hastened to fetch a glass of water from a set bowl in a neighboring alcove. Dashing the cold fluid in her face, he was heartened to observe an immediate response on her part, and was watching the bewildered opening of her eyes when a chill shot through him and threatened to reduce him to the very state from which she was emerging, for the seemingly silent laboratory was not as silent as it had appeared to be, but held the murmurs of a tense, muffled conversation in tones too low for comprehension, yet of a quality profoundly disturbing to the soul. It was not, of course, new for Charles to mutter formulae, but this muttering was definitely different. It was so palpably a dialogue, or imitation of a dialogue, with the regular alteration of inflections, suggesting question and answer, statement and response. One voice was undisguisedly that of Charles, but the other had a depth and hollowness which the youth's best powers of ceremonial mimicry had scarcely approached before. There was something hideous, blasphemous, and abnormal about it, and but for a cry from his recovering wife, which cleared his mind by arousing his protective instincts, it is not likely that Theodore Howland Ward could have maintained for nearly a year more his old boast that he had never fainted. As it was, he seized his wife in his arms and bore her quickly downstairs before she could notice the voices which had so horribly disturbed him. Even so, however, he was not quick enough to escape catching something himself, which caused him to stagger dangerously with his burden. For Mrs. Ward's cry had evidently been heard by others than he, and there had come in response to it, from behind the locked door, the first distinguishable words which that masked and terrible colloquy had yielded. They were merely an excited caution in Charles's own voice, but somehow their implications held a nameless fright for the father who overheard them. The phrase was just this: "Shh! Right!" Mr. and Mrs. Ward conferred at some length after dinner, and the former resolved to have a firm and serious talk with Charles that very night. No matter how important the object, such conduct could no longer be permitted, for these latest developments transcended every limit of sanity and formed a menace to the order and nervous well-being of the entire household. The youth must indeed have taken complete leave of his senses, since only downright madness could have prompted the wild screams and imaginary conversations in assumed voices, which the present day had brought forth. All this must be stopped, or Mrs. Ward would be made ill, and the keeping of servants became an impossibility. Mr. Ward rose at the close of the meal and started upstairs for Charles's laboratory. On the third floor, however, he paused at the sounds which he heard proceeding from the now disused library of his son. Books were apparently being flung about, and papers wildly rustled, and upon stepping to the door, Mr. Ward beheld the youth within, excitedly assembling a vast armful of literary matter of every size and shape. Charles's aspect was very drawn and haggard, and he dropped his entire load with a start at the sound of his father's voice. At the elder man's command, he sat down, and for some time listened to the admonitions he had so long deserved. There was no scene. At the end of the lecture, he agreed that his father was right, and that his noises, mutterings, incantations, and chemical odors were indeed inexcusable nuisances. He agreed to a policy of greater quiet, though insisting on a prolongation of his extreme privacy. Much of his future work, he said, was in any case purely book research, and he could obtain quarters elsewhere for any such vocal rituals as might be necessary at a later stage. For the fright and fainting of his mother he expressed the keenest contrition, and explained that the conversation later heard was part of an elaborate symbolism designed to create a certain mental atmosphere. His use of abstruse technical terms somewhat bewildered Mr. Ward, but the parting impression was one of undeniable sanity and poise, despite a mysterious tension of the utmost gravity. The interview was really quite inconclusive, and as Charles picked up his armful and left the room, Mr. Ward hardly knew what to make of the entire business. It was as mysterious as the death of poor old Nig, whose stiffening form had been found an hour before in the basement, with staring eyes and fear-distorted mouth. Driven by some vague detective instinct, the bewildered parent now glanced curiously at the vacant shelves to see what his son had taken up to the attic. The youth's library was plainly and rigidly classified, so that one might tell at a glance the books, or at least the kind of books, which had been withdrawn. On this occasion, Mr. Ward was astonished to find that nothing of the occult or the antiquarian, beyond what had been previously removed, was missing. These new withdrawals were all modern items: histories, scientific treatises, geographies, manuals of literature, philosophic works, and certain contemporary newspapers and magazines. It was a very curious shift from Charles Ward's recent run of reading, and the father paused in a growing vortex of perplexity and an engulfing sense of strangeness. The strangeness was a very poignant sensation, and almost clawed at his chest as he strove to see just what was wrong around him. Something was indeed wrong, and tangibly as well as spiritually so. Ever since he had been in this room, he had known that something was amiss, and at last it dawned upon him what it was. On the north wall rose still the ancient carved overmantel from the house in Olney Court, but to the cracked and precariously restored oils of the large Curwen portrait, disaster had come. Time and unequal heating had done their work at last, and at some time since the room's last cleaning, the worst had happened. Peeling clear of the wood, curling tighter and tighter, and finally crumbling into small bits with what must have been malignly silent suddenness, the portrait of Joseph Curwen had resigned forever its staring surveillance of the youth it so strangely resembled, and now lay scattered on the floor as a thin coating of fine bluish-grey dust.